Dobro. History. Archive.
If you ask most people when the Korean War ended, they'll almost certainly tell you 1953.
Mm-hmm.
But that date, that year, it only tells half the story, doesn't it?
It really does.
Because in 1953, the war did not conclude with a peace treaty or, mutual recognition. It ended with an armistice, a ceasefire.
And that distinction is just. It's vital. It means that for 7 decades, the two Koreas have not been at peace. They've been locked in what we can only describe as a frozen war.
A cold conflict.
Exactly, separated only by a very thin, very tense sheet of ice.
And when that ice cracks, the stakes escalate instantly, and the consequences are, well, they're lethal and immediate.
Yeah.
We are going to dive deep today into one of the most violent, terrifying, and I think revealing incidents of this frozen war. A scenario that just perfectly illustrates this danger.
Okay, so let's start with the most critical component, which is the geography.
Right.
Imagine for a moment you were standing on the coast, maybe looking out over the water, and you see an island looming just off the shoreline. That island is not yours. That island, just 7.5 miles or 12 kilometers away, belongs to a hostile foreign nation, a nation perpetually primed for conflict.
That is the daily reality for the residents and the South Korean soldiers stationed on Yeonpyeong Island.
It is.
And this isn't a large landmass we're talking about. It's a tiny patch of South Korean territory, maybe 7 square kilometers. But it sits there like a tiny boat in a massive hostile sea just miles from the North Korean mainland.
It's the very definition of a forward operating base. I mean, it is a South Korean outpost surrounded on 3 sides by the enemy.
Yeah.
The sources we studied, they describe the island in the most vivid and honestly brutal terms as being positioned like a knife held to the throat of the South.
Our mission in this deep dive, then, is to unpack the events of November 23, 2010. This was the day that Chosun War didn't just crack. It violently boiled over. We're going to analyze the intense, calculated political motivations driving decisions in Pyongyang, the catastrophic military miscalculations on the South Korean side, and most importantly, the intensely human stories of sacrifice we found in the sources.
And this wasn't a spontaneous or accidental escalation. I think that's a crucial insight that we need to keep coming back to.
Yeah.
We found overwhelming evidence that suggests this was a calculated, premeditated performance orchestrated for a very specific internal audience in the North.
Yes, and our key takeaway, which we'll validate throughout this, is that this attack was designed as a show of force, a political tool.
Right.
Yet the cost, the tragic, immediate human cost, was paid not by high-ranking political figures, but by young soldiers and unsuspecting civilians on this isolated island outpost.
A very high cost.
Okay, let's unpack this crucial history.
Yeah.
We have to start with the unyielding reality of Yeonpyeong Island. It's a tiny speck, but its geopolitical significance is immense. It's a terrifying defensive outpost because it's just so intertwined with the conflict zone.
Yeah.
Why is that area so vital?
Well, it all comes down to the water. The sea lanes surrounding Yeonpyeong Island are the absolute epicenter of the maritime dispute between the two Koreas.
Okay.
When the Korean War ground to a halt with the Armistice Agreement in July 1953, the United Nations Command needed a way to ensure that naval forces didn't accidentally or deliberately clash in the Yellow Sea.
So they drew a line.
They did. They established what they called the Northern Limit Line, or the NLL.
The NLL.
Now, this line was intended to maintain separation and prevent future maritime clashes. It was clearly marked on UN maps, and for the South, it was the definitive border.
But I want to pause on that word definitive, because that word means absolutely nothing to the North, does it?
Nothing at all.
That line, the NLL, is the origin of the entire conflict.
Precisely. This is the crucial historical context that you have to understand. The NLL was drawn unilaterally by the UN command, which was dominated by the U.S.
Right.
North Korea was never involved in its demarcation. They never accepted it. And they have disputed the maritime boundaries around the 5 islands in this area, including Yeonpyeong, ever since.
It's not just a political dispute over lines on a map, though, is it? It's also an economic dispute. I mean, what makes this patch of sea so vital that North Korea is willing to risk total war over it?
Well, it is immensely important, both ecologically and economically. This area, known as the Western Sea, is one of the most lucrative and abundant fishing grounds in the entire Korean peninsula.
Okay.
Specifically, it's famous for blue crab.
Wow.
So for the fishermen on both sides and for the governments managing those resources, control over this area translates directly into significant revenue and food supply.
So the NLL is not just a military flashpoint. It's a crab-rich, contested zone, meaning the stakes are immediate, tangible, and perpetual. This patch of sea is always ready to erupt.
That's exactly right. And this history of friction didn't just begin in 2010. The ice had cracked violently multiple times before. We saw naval skirmishes, known as the First and Second Battle of Yeonpyeong, break out in 1999 and again in 2002. These were serious, bloody engagements involving multiple vessels.
These were not minor incidents. They were clear, high-stakes warnings that the ceasefire was fragile at best.
Absolutely.
But the immediate context leading up to November 2010, I mean, that made the atmosphere particularly toxic. The tension was at its absolute zenith.
We have to recall the event that occurred just 8 months prior, in March 2010, the sinking of the South Korean warship, the Cheonan.
A profound national tragedy for South Korea.
It was.
Could you just remind us of the details and the implications of that attack?
Of course. The Cheonan was a major warship on a routine patrol near Pyongyang Island, another of the disputed islands near the NLL. And it was suddenly and violently split in half.
Wow.
46 young sailors were killed.
And the subsequent international investigation was incredibly thorough and damning.
It was. An international team of experts from the US, UK, Australia, and others confirmed with overwhelming evidence that the cause was a heavy torpedo fired by a North Korean midget submarine.
So, not an accident.
Not an accident. This was a direct, lethal act of war. And it dramatically raised the military temperature across the entire border.
This is critical context.
Yeah.
So by November 2010, South Korea was still reeling from the murder of 46 of its sailors. They had military exercises ongoing. They had a disputed, lucrative, and hostile border running right next to one of their major outposts.
The picture is one of maximum military tension. The sinking of the Cheonan hadn't been avenged or settled. The NLL remained disputed. The political and emotional environment meant the ice was just dangerously thin.
Right.
It only required a minor spark, real or manufactured, to ignite the entire region into a new conflict.
Let's turn now to that spark, which many analysts initially believed was a reaction, but which our sources suggest was actually a calculated pretext.
That spark ostensibly came in the form of a routine military exercise known as the 𝐃𝐿 drill.
The 𝐃𝐿 drill.
On the morning of November 23, 2010, the South Korean Marines stationed on Yeonpyeong were conducting standard maneuvers.
And the key component of this drill was the use of their most sophisticated artillery system, the K9 self-propelled howitzers. These are massive 155mm cannon platforms.
Right, and the South Korean military firmly maintained that this was a standard training procedure. They claimed they were firing their shells southwest, deliberately into their own territorial waters, away from North Korean land.
So in their view, they were operating entirely within their sovereign rights and the bounds of the NLL.
Exactly.
But the North instantly challenged this assumption. We have hard evidence that they issued a direct warning early that morning.
Yes. At 8:20 a.m., a direct telegram arrived from North Korean command. And this wasn't the usual vague, aggressive rhetoric. It was specific and explicit.
What did it say?
The message warned South Korea that if they fired shells into what North Korea considered their territory, which to the north included the contested NLL waters, they would not sit idly by. It was an overt threat of retaliation.
Okay, and here's the question that defines the entire tragedy. What was the South Korean military's immediate reaction to this specific high-stakes threat, especially just 8 months after the Cheonan sinking?
They dismissed it.
They dismissed it.
They dismissed it. The South Korean chain of command categorized the warning as routine bluster. They had received similar threats hundreds of times over the years. They believed that North Korea was simply trying to disrupt their training schedule, and so they proceeded with the drill.
This, then, is the classic catastrophic point of miscalculation. The South saw a routine drill, defensive in nature, executed within their rights. The North insisted this was a provocation and had issued a direct threat.
Right.
But we have to ask, given the environment, wasn't dismissing that threat a catastrophic failure of intelligence, not just routine bluster?
It absolutely was. The critical error was in assessing North Korea's intent. They assumed the North was operating on old rules of engagement, that threats were usually empty. What they failed to recognize was that the rules of engagement had dramatically changed, not because of the South Korean drill, but because of intense political maneuvering happening 300 miles away in Pyongyang.
That shifts the entire framework. What specific evidence from the sources supports the idea that the drill was merely a pretext for an attack that was already planned?
So we have to look at the internal politics of the North Korean regime at that exact moment. At this time, Kim Jong-il, the longtime dictator, was aging and in poor health.
Right.
He was actively accelerating the process of transitioning power to his youngest son, Kim Jong-un.
And in North Korea, a dynastic succession isn't based on political consensus or popular vote. It's based entirely on martial strength.
Exactly. The foundational ideology of North Korea is Juche, and within that, the principle of Songun, or military first. An untested young leader like Kim Jong-un, who was barely 27 years old and had spent most of his life studying in Switzerland.
Right.
He needed to establish his authority instantly and ruthlessly in the eyes of the powerful, entrenched military elite. He needed a victory.
So, the argument is that the attack on Yeonpyeong wasn't about the NLL or fishing rights or a South Korean drill. It was fundamentally about Kim Jong-un proving his military mettle.
Proving his credentials.
And shoring up support through a short, brutal, victorious demonstration of power. It was a calculated political performance.
It was a vital part of his transition to supreme leader.
Yeah.
And furthermore, the sources point out that this attack foreshadowed what would become the Pyongyang line, the doctrine of parallel development of the economy and nuclear weapons.
Okay.
To pursue such an ambitious militaristic strategy, Kim Jong-un first had to demonstrate he was willing to shed blood to protect his territory.
And the evidence of premeditation here is genuinely chilling. We have more than just analysts' theories. South Korean intelligence later confirmed an indisputable physical link to the leadership.
This is perhaps the most damning piece of information regarding the premeditation. Kim Jong-il and his son, Kim Jong-un, had personally visited the exact artillery base that would launch the barrage on Yeonpyeong.
When?
Just one day before the attack occurred.
One day. Wow.
One day.
Think about that carefully. They didn't just visit a random military unit to boost morale. They visited the specific location, the gun batteries, that would launch 170 shells the following afternoon.
It moves the event squarely out of the category of a spontaneous, heated reaction to a perceived slight.
Completely.
It was a calculated, premeditated military action scheduled specifically to serve a political transition. The Hoguk drill was simply the convenient pretext. The performance was the objective.
The performance was scheduled. Now, let's talk about the horrific reality of that performance when it played out on the island itself.
The Marines on Yeonpyeong finished their routine drill around noon. They packed up their gear, cleaned their massive guns, the K9s, and, went to eat lunch or relax, assuming the usual tension had passed.
But the North Koreans were operating on a different clock. They didn't respond immediately.
Right.
They waited. They waited 2.5 agonizing hours, ensuring the South Koreans had fully relaxed their guard, making their target as vulnerable as possible.
And the attack began at 14.34, 2.34 p.m.
The description of the attack itself is crucial, isn't it?
Yeah.
This wasn't a slow sequential firing.
No, it was a time-on-target barrage. North Korea used multiple artillery batteries, including M46 field guns and 122mm multiple rocket launchers firing simultaneously.
Wow.
They calculated the trajectories and timing so that all 170 shells landed at the very same second for maximum concentration, shock, and destruction.
The auditory experience must have been apocalyptic. The sudden shift from a quiet afternoon to ground zero.
It was instant, overwhelming violence. And at that exact catastrophic moment of initial impact, we find Staff Sergeant Seo Jung-woo at the ferry terminal.
This young man's story is just heartbreaking. He was a short-timer, a soldier whose mandatory service was complete.
Yeah.
His bag was packed, his papers were signed. The ferry that would take him across the water to the mainland, to freedom, to his future life, was right there. He was technically out of the combat zone.
But then he heard the sound. Not a thump, but the horrifying, escalating sound they train for. The whistling, screaming arrival of incoming artillery, followed by the violent shrump of mass impact.
All right.
He turned and saw thick, oily black smoke immediately rising from the direction of his base.
This is the moment of impossible choice. No one would have blamed him for getting on the boat. He was safe. His duty was done.
But his brothers, the young recruits, the men he trained alongside, they were engulfed in that smoke and fire.
So what did he do?
We know what he did. He dropped his packed bag, the symbol of his freedom, and he ran. He ran away from the ferry and directly toward the explosions.
Wow.
The sheer selfless instinct of duty overruling safety is it's staggering.
And as Sergeant 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 ran toward the base, the shelling continued, raining down steel and fire, not just on the military installation, but on the island's small village.
Yes.
This was a critical and terrifying escalation. It was the first time North Korea had aimed artillery directly at a South Korean civilian town since the armistice in 1953.
Witness testimony from the civilian survivors paints a grim, terrifying picture of that moment the war came home. A 70-year-old resident named Jung Chung-kwon recounted that the shells rained down, smoke billowed everywhere, and within minutes, everything was engulfed in flames and destroyed.
He thought the war had started again.
He genuinely believed that the full-scale Korean War had just broken out again.
We have to consider the immediate infrastructure collapse. The first barrage wasn't just destructive, it was paralyzing.
It was.
It instantly knocked out all power and communications across the entire island. Residents couldn't call for help. They couldn't turn on a radio. They were blind and isolated.
The chaos was absolute. The island's 1,700 residents had to scramble immediately for the reinforced concrete bunkers built into the hillsides specifically for this purpose.
But getting there must have been a nightmare under fire.
It was. We hear the harrowing detail of Lim Jung-in, a 36-year-old mother, who fled with her 3 young children, including a tiny 9-month-old baby strapped to her back.
Oh my.
She later recounted the sensory experience, hearing the terrifying sound of incoming shells and feeling the concussion and shrapnel flying just above her head.
And as they fled, the destruction was so widespread that even the natural landscape caught fire.
The mountainside caught fire. The civilians were fleeing through smoke, heat, and the sound of artillery, running toward underground shelters while their homes burned behind them.
And meanwhile, Staff Sergeant Seo Jung-woo was running into the heart of that fire, toward the Marine base that was designated Ground Zero.
The North Koreans had done their reconnaissance well. The time-on-target barrage was mercilessly accurate, hitting the most critical military targets first. Shells landed directly on the barracks, the mess hall, and most importantly, the K9 artillery bunkers themselves.
Inside those bunkers, the Marines were facing an impossible situation. We have the iconic moment of Lance Corporal Im Joo-young, who was the loader for one of the K9 crews. He was performing the intensely physical job of feeding the massive gun.
Imagine the scene inside that steel shell. It's deafeningly loud, even in peacetime. But when an explosion rocks the bunker, filling the space with noise, extreme pressure, and heat, the environment becomes survivable only through sheer will.
The sources detail that the overpressure from a nearby blast was so immense that the camouflage netting wrapped around Im Joo-young's helmet actually caught fire. He was literally burning at the point of action.
And this is the moment that defined the response. He refused to stop. He didn't take off the helmet, didn't stop to pat out the flame.
He just kept going.
He continued to operate, yelling for the next shell, focusing only on feeding the gun. He understood that the only way to save the island, the only way to save themselves, was to return fire and make the North stop.
That incredible resolve, however, didn't translate into an immediate counterattack, did it?
No.
For the Marines fighting inside and the civilians hiding in shelters, there was an agonizing silence from their side. 1 minute passed. 5. 10. Why were the high-tech South Korean guns silent? This 13-minute delay became a massive national controversy in the aftermath. The public demanded answers.
The sources revealed that the delay was a perfect storm of technical vulnerability and logistical paralysis. The North Koreans had designed their attack to exploit the vulnerabilities of South Korea's advanced system.
Let's detail the first major problem: devastation versus high-tech. What exactly did the K9 possess, and how did the North Koreans disable it so quickly?
The K9 Thunder is a highly advanced self-propelled howitzer. It boasts a very rapid rate of fire, up to 6 rounds per minute, and crucially, it uses sophisticated digital fire control systems.
So radar, GPS, computers.
Exactly. Everything to allow it to calculate trajectories and hit targets precisely over long distances. It is a 21st century weapon.
But advanced systems are often fragile systems.
And that's exactly what happened. Of the 6 K9 howitzers stationed on the island, the attack instantly disabled 2 of them. The sheer concussion and the shrapnel from the 122mm rockets effectively fried the computers and the advanced fire control system.
So they weren't destroyed, just blinded.
They were blinded. Their brains were disabled. A third gun also suffered a temporary mechanical jam.
So the high-tech advantage was neutralized immediately. What was the second paralyzing problem?
Problem number 2 was logistics, and this ties directly back to the routine drill. The 𝐏𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐂 exercise they had completed just hours earlier had consumed most of their ready ammunition. The K9 carries a magazine of ready-to-use shells, but those racks were nearly empty. The reserve ammunition stores were located deeper inside the bunkers or in separate facilities, requiring manual labor to access.
So in those critical minutes, you have to picture this hellish scene. They are under direct fire, the power is out, the computers are dead, the sophisticated radar feed is gone. They have 3 functional guns, but they're critically low on immediate ammunition.
The multi-million-dollar state-of-the-art artillery system was suddenly useless in its high-tech capacity.
So what do?
That forced the Marines to adopt what was essentially a World War II fighting posture. They had to shift instantly from advanced warfare protocols to manual, brute force tactics just to survive.
Tell us about that switch. What did going low-tech mean under those conditions?
It meant muscle and sheer bravery. First, they had to pry open the heavy steel doors of the reserve ammunition bunkers, which were often damaged by the shelling. Then they had to haul the massive 155-millimeter shells by hand.
These things are heavy.
Each of these rounds weighs nearly 100 pounds. Imagine physically hauling 100-pound cylinders one after the other under immense stress, noise, and fear just to reach the gun chamber.
And once they got the shells to the guns, they couldn't rely on the computers for aiming.
Correct. The computerized aiming systems were dead. They had to aim the massive cannons manually using archaic backup optical sights.
So they're doing it by eye.
Basically, they were manually calculating trajectory and elevation based on decades-old training protocols, essentially turning 21st century soldiers into 1940s artillery crews.
It was a desperate, courageous scramble to overcome technical paralysis through pure physical determination.
And their determination paid off. 13 minutes after the first North Korean shell slammed into the island, at 14:47 p.m., the first South Korean K9 howitzer fired back.
I can't imagine what a relief that sound must have been.
For the civilians hiding in the bunkers, it must have been the sound of hope finally arriving.
They fired 50 rounds initially, but they didn't stop there. They were tenacious.
They were. They managed to successfully repair the radar link on one of the guns, even under fire, and fired another 30 rounds.
And that did the trick.
This robust and determined counterstrike was the breaking point. It caused the North Korean shelling to first become sporadic, then wildly inaccurate, and then cease entirely. The main, terrifying exchange of artillery fire lasted just 68 minutes. But those minutes changed everything.
When the counterstrike succeeded and the air finally fell silent, the Marines emerged from their smoking bunkers, and the civilians cautiously crept out of the shelters. The immediate and tragic task was to count the cost of that 68 minutes of renewed war.
The final toll was 4 South Koreans killed, 2 young Marines and 2 civilians. 19 soldiers and 3 civilians were also wounded.
A heavy price for an hour of fighting.
A very heavy price.
We need to spend time honoring the 2 young Marines who were lost, starting with Private First Class Moon Gwang-wook.
Moon Gwang-wook was only 20 years old, a new recruit who had just joined the Marines in August, barely 3 months earlier.
Just a kid.
He was killed instantly in that first devastating time-on-target barrage inside the howitzer installation. He died before he had even fully learned his role.
The grief of the families, even years later, tells the story of the devastating toll. 6 years after the attack, his father spoke at a memorial service, sharing a profound truth. 6 years might be long for some, but for us, those 6 years were full of pain and sorrow. Our lives stopped back then.
Our lives stopped back then.
That phrase, that's the lasting consequence of the Frozen War.
And then there is the story that encapsulates the impossible choice of Yeonpyeong. Staff Sergeant Sejong-woo, the man we last saw running from the ferry terminal toward the explosions, and his duty.
The Marines searched the base for him, hoping he had made it to the fight, that he had perhaps even helped load the guns.
But they found him dead on the road that led back to his base. He was killed by shrapnel from a 122-millimeter rocket.
So he never made it.
He died in that small, desperate space between safety and duty. He never made it to his boat, but he also never made it to his gun. He made the ultimate choice to stand by his brothers, and he paid the ultimate price. His sacrifice became an immediate, powerful symbol of the selfless ethos of the South Korean Marine Corps.
When we talk about the price of duty, we naturally focus on the soldiers. But the sources reveal a truly incredible story of civilian sacrifice, an unexpected connection that shows the conflict spared no one.
On the Marine base, A new residential building was under construction. A team of civilian construction workers was on site when the shells began to fall, meaning they were deeply exposed and unexpected targets.
So they're caught in the middle of a military attack.
Completely. And two of the older workers, 61-year-old 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 and 60-year-old 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓, immediately took charge of the crisis for their colleagues.
They didn't prioritize their own escape?
No, they successfully gathered 10 of their fellow employees and staff, and they methodically led that entire group to safety in a nearby shelter, ensuring they survived the worst of the barrage.
But after making sure those 10 people were safe, the 2 older men were reported missing.
Tragically, the final chapter of their story was written the next day. After the massive fires were extinguished and rescue workers sifted through the rubble of the construction site, they found the bodies of 𝐃𝐄𝐄𝐏 and 𝐏𝐻𝐃𝐂𝐀𝐒𝐓.
Wow.
They saved 10 people, and they were the only 2 from that site who didn't survive the attack.
Their sacrifice carries immense historical weight. These 2 men were the first South Korean civilians to be killed by a direct North Korean artillery attack since the signing of the armistice, 57 years earlier.
It just proves that when the war cracks, the burden falls on everyone on the island, uniform or not.
And when the smoke cleared, the physical devastation was staggering.
Yeonpyeong was a ruin, a scarred, blackened landscape. Photos from the aftermath showed dozens of houses that were just gone, their walls blown out, their cars twisted into black metal wreckage.
It's the small, haunting details that always stick with you. The sources mention one specific image, a stack of damaged plates sitting untouched on a pillar in a house that literally no longer had any walls.
It's a surreal picture of domestic life instantly shattered by a geopolitical decision made hundreds of miles away.
Yeah.
The global reaction was one of pure alarm. The world was on a razor's edge. The UN quickly declared it one of the most serious incidents since the end of the Korean War, genuinely fearing that the frozen war would thaw completely and start a regional inferno.
For those terrifying 68 minutes, the world was closer to renewed, full-scale conflict on the Korean peninsula than it had been in decades. We've analyzed the calculated layers of this deep dive. We explored the primary political motive, Kim Jong-un establishing his power credentials and the shift in North Korean strategy. We explored the catastrophic 13-minute military delay caused by the efficacy of the initial attack and the low-tech vulnerability of that advanced K9 system.
And most importantly, we've shared the extraordinary human courage displayed in response.
Yeah.
The young Marines hauling 100-pound shells by hand, facing a 21st century attack with the tactics of a World War II artillery crew.
Right.
And the older civilian workers who ran toward the fire and chaos to save their colleagues.
This incident forcefully reminds us that for most of the world, the Korean War is history. It's a black and white photograph in a book, a long-forgotten diplomatic issue.
But on Yeonpyeong Island, the war is geography. It is the immediate, dangerous present. The war never truly ended. It is merely an unstable ceasefire.
And that ceasefire was violently, brutally broken for 68 minutes on November 23, 2010.
Right.
The island burned, the houses burned, and the mountainside burned. But the men inside the bunkers, their helmets literally on fire, did not stop fighting. We focus today on the physical and human cost they paid immediately.
Yeah.
The lingering question we leave you with, one to explore on your own, builds on this concept of individual action in crisis. When a frozen conflict cracks like this, how much does the threat of true regional escalation depend purely on the immediate instinctual actions of the individuals under fire? The Marine commanders choosing manual fire, the loaders refusing to drop their helmets, the civilians deciding to lead others to safety, rather than on the high-level, slower political decisions made in distant capitals? Is individual courage the real fire break against total war?
Yeah.